Hi, everybody. My name is Geeta Lakshmi, and I'm from Lincoln Business School. I'm an associate professor there. I am trying to bring together a panel which is extremely esteemed and discussing a very important aspect of sustainability. Sustainability, as we know it, is the idea of using resources wisely such that we are able to meet the needs of the present without dipping into the resources for the future generations. To that effect, the GDP has been a woeful failure, and we have been discussing it in economics for a long time. This idea has been taken forward in various terms, in terms of the Human Development Index, because GDP by itself does not recognize aspects such as externalities. Today, we have got a panel to look at the ideas of measuring sustainability through various case studies and the problems which can arise due to that. So I'm very pleased to welcome various people. So we have, first of all, Dr. Anjan Ray from India, who has kindly taken time to join us. Dr. Anjan Ray is the director at Indian Institute of Petroleum and has got a PhD in chemical engineering from University of Pennsylvania. He has been involved in the private as well as the public sector and is now looking after national policy initiatives to bring in some ideas of sustainability. We have Mr. Jody Chapman from the South Brent Energy Turbine. So welcome, Jody, who's been able to join us today. And then we have, last but not least, Simon Tilley, who is from the Hockerton Housing Project, who has been an active promoter of sustainable Hockerton, one of the case studies which we are going to talk about today. So over to you, Simon, first of all, about your experiences with the sustainable Hockerton housing, with the sustainable Hockerton.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Simon Tilley. I have two hats on, really. I have developed and worked with Hockerton Housing Project, and from that community group, we also manage the Sustainable Hockerton project, which started about 2006. We were starting to get together. So I've got a few images to show you, which will kind of highlight very briefly kind of how we set things up and how we've gone on to produce energy, and then just to think about how we're measuring what we've done and how successful we've been with that. So I'm going to share my screen with you to look at the PowerPoint presentation I've got. Hopefully you'll be able to see that now. So yeah, there you can see on the right a picture of the wind turbine that we eventually got up, which is our first renewable energy project. And you can see myself cycling down there, having had a successful turn on of the turbine back in 2010. And it really all started with groups of people coming to where I live. I'm sitting in my kitchen here, but this is the roof of my house, and we've had people coming to visit Hockerton Housing Project for a long time. And our mission here is to promote sustainability and act as a catalyst, really. And this is we're earth sheltered. That's why the people are standing on the roof of my house there. It's not obvious, but that's the case. But bringing people and just getting people to think about sustainability and how we get it out there, I suppose, and how other people can take it on board. From our project here in Hockerton, the housing project, we realised that there was a lot of motivation in the village to think about sustainability for the houses that are already built. And we were getting together as a community, and we had many meetings, I think over 20 meetings over quite a long period of time, several years, thinking about how some way we could improve the sustainability of the whole village. And it came down to, in the end, deciding that we'd try and build a renewable energy project that could supply money to help do the things that don't necessarily have an income generation side. So, for instance, insulating a house to keep the heat in the winter. So there were many many groups, like many times like this, where we got together to try and decide what to do. And of course, only a few people come to those meetings. So we had sort of outreach, if you like. We created a survey which we sent around to the whole village, and this gave us an opportunity for people that didn't come to the meetings to really put their input into the decision-making process of what might happen. So this was some of the results. You could see it's a quite small village, by the way, so you can see from the numbers they're fairly low, but a lot of people that responded wanted to take action, and quite a lot of those 28 saying where they actually wanted a wind turbine, which if you it's certainly in England, it's been very contentious, wind turbines, but actually it seems that people really do want them. I think most people might assume from the news reports that the results would have been the other way around, 28 against, but here we had 28 for and only 4 against, which was a good sign. It meant we felt empowered to carry on with the idea. And not only that, quite a few of those people wanted to invest in it, which was even more encouraging. So of the people that were there, 20 people responding were saying they actually wanted to invest in the project. And that ended up being true in the final sort of raising the money to actually get this project going. We needed to raise over £200,000, and we achieved that. And quite a lot of that money, as you can see here, came from the local community. So in terms of numbers of people, sort of half from Hockerton, and NG25 is our local postcode, Southwell area. And in terms of the actual money invested, about 2/3 came from really very local, so Hockerton and just the surrounding area. And then not too far afield from there, so Nottinghamshire, it shows there was a lot of local support, but a few people from further afield also putting in some money to help build it. Now, these are the easy things to measure. So money coming into the bank account is an easy thing to measure, and it's easy to get these quite accurate pie graphs. That's just thinking about that for what this whole talk is about. So then, we bought a wind turbine, bought a second-hand one. Here you can see us putting together some of the parts. This is bolting on the blades to the hub, and then lifting that assembly up to the tower that you can see here for Sustainable Hockerton. And you can see some people at the top of the tower ready to catch this thing and bolt it on. And this will then be a 225 kilowatt generator when the wind is blowing at 12 meters a second or above. It is now working successfully. And some of the other things that we've sort of achieved from that is a lot more local interest. So Southwell is our local town, and there's lots of families and people getting together there to think about sustainability. And that's one of the things that's difficult to measure, the impact you have on people in the surrounding area by doing these things, and helping them make more sort of better decisions, if you like, in terms of sustainability. So we've looked at different areas, and Geeta's going to sort of follow on from this in a minute, but the economic areas, measuring the finances is great to do. How much money do you spend? How much money do you make? And you can do that relatively easy. The other areas which are much more difficult to assess, I suppose, but are equally as important to the social and the environmental aspects of the project, because obviously to tackle climate change and to keep our resources for future generations, we have to get these right, the social and the environmental impacts, and yet they're very difficult to measure. And I will talk about later on the value of autonomy, which is a simpler case, but even so is quite tricky to measure as well. So that's a very quick introduction into Sustainable Hockerton and what we've done here. So we've put up some renewable energies, and we're generating income, and we're trying to do various projects with that income in the local community. So there you are. That's me. So I will stop sharing now, hopefully. There we go. So am I back with you? Yes, there we go. So
Thanks, Simon. I'll take it on from there. I was actually involved with Simon in the Sustainable Hockerton initiative. Simon already had some expertise from setting up the Hockerton Housing Project, and I thought it was a good idea that we'd work together to bring some more sustainability for the community in the wider village. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, talking a little bit about how I teach finance and corporate finance. So it was very fascinating to see things which impact our daily lives and bring us great pleasure and um, do good for the community, but they're not often talked about in corporate finance. And I thought to myself, why not try and measure the other aspects which are not traditionally bought into the what corporates look at in terms of how they reward their investors. So I'm going to try and share my screen now, and hopefully you should be able to see what is going on in a minute. And so if I can just talk you through this slide presentation. So I'm trying to measure sustainability in a form which is about um, looking at from using sustainable Hockerton as a case study. So we normally teach our students, or we teach in corporate finance or in economics, the idea of return to stakeholders, and usually the stakeholders are the investors. We are trying to bring into this presentation two new aspects or two new measures, and they are called return on stakeholders, which is slightly different from return on investors. So stakeholders is a wider term, and concurrently we have the cost of stakeholders, which is also slightly different from the cost of capital, which is used traditionally in corporates. So the idea is to bring across the framework to recognize that there are wider stakeholder contributions when we set up projects of this kind, and a community energy renewable company is often trying to balance three objectives: not just the investment from the finance side, but also the investment from the environment side, without which that particular company could not function, as also the community. Simon just talked about how much effort was put in to try and bring this to fruition, and that effort needs to be recognized. So, the idea of using these two measures or proposing these two measures is to have some kind of signpost or signals for similar companies or more than profit companies to try and see where they are going. So there are three very clear investors or three very clear stakeholders in this kind of idea. You have the shock, which is sitting here, the community energy enterprise. You have the environment, which is doing its bit. Without the wind, we could not function. The turbine would be useless. We have financial investors who have given capital to the project. And we have the community, which has also put itself into involved itself into these discussions and helped in putting this thing forward. Community capital is actually discussed quite widely in economics, but has been sitting in a separate realm. And there have been various writers who have talked about it, chiefly Robert Putnam, Hannafin, who have talked about the fact that there is trust, or there is social capital, or there's banked goodwill, or there are norms and networks which help us to glue together various aspects. It's not just about the money, but there's the invisible glue which often helps in holding communities together. In a wider sense, when you look at the COVID problem, you see that there's a lot of help going from and voluntary work which is happening to try and bring across and make sure that everybody is safe. So there are aspects of community capital, but usually corporates do not recognize this. We then have the environment, and as I said, without the environment, we wouldn't be able to survive. What we take for granted is the idea of clean air, and we have countries where the air has become so polluted, people have to wear masks not only for COVID, but even pre-COVID. Oxygen cylinders had to be bought. There is a problem that If you have too much pollution, you get diseases associated with it. So lack of pollution itself is a sort of capital which people need to recognize. Then, of course, there is natural resources like our turbine, which help in the co-production of economic activity, either directly or indirectly. And also examples of the environment is that people often pay uh, a premium to live in greener areas, to have a mountain view, or to live by the sea, or to go on such places. If you think of cruises, there's a whole lot of activities which are very highly dependent on environment being just correct. That's the natural environment which I'm talking about. So our two measures are return on stakeholders' capital, which I will distinguish from stakeholders' return on investors' capital. And then we have associated with it the cost of stakeholders' capital. This first one, I think, is more of an accounting concept, and I'll explain why. But if you take into account all the stakeholders and you look at what you're returning to them, you can then bring about sustainability or a sustainable return. This will result in society trying to offer capital for less at less cost, and that's hence the second term is more of an economic concept. So Simon has just described this process, and there are numerous steps which I have very sort of in a very succinct way tried to encapsulate in this particular slide. We need not go through it. I think Simon has gone through a lot of detail about how it was first started and promoted. We started talking about this in 2007, and then finally we got permission in 2009. Production started in 2010. We had a village survey done in 2007. So we formed a society in 2010, and then that led to a final enterprise called Sustainable Hockerton. Returning back to conventional theory and practice, usually what we have is any company or any firm which let's suppose it has two types of financial investors, and usually those financial investors are shareholders or lenders. So you have the owners who are the shareholders, and then you have the lenders who are traditionally the banks. And to calculate the capital or the cost of capital to the company, which rewards its lenders and its owners by giving them dividends and interest. So the overall cost to the company is just a weighted average of the two. So if you have D, which is um, the amount of debt a company has, and E, which is the amount of share value it's taken up, and it's given out, then what you would have is an equation which is very easily recognizable in corporate finance as the cost of capital. Now, the cost of capital to the company is always a form of return to capital also for the shareholders and the investors, because it's returning to those two classes the same amount. In other words, the two things are symmetrical. What we propose is that if we can borrow quite easily from these concepts, we can say if we have three stakeholders, namely the environment, which is I represent by W, and the financiers, which I represent by F, and S, which is the society or the community, and we are rewarding them with some return. In financiers, we're rewarding them K%. Into the environment, we're offering the environment E%, and to the society or to the community, we are offering C%. And borrowing from the previous slide, what we have is just another weighted average or an index, and we can put it very simply like that. So there's nothing very distinctive about this, except what I'm trying to bring across in this presentation is the idea that we should be recognizing the capital invested by the environment as well as the capital invested by the society. And that's where I think I depart slightly from previous attempts, and I'm trying to do that. So the question is, it's how do you measure these things? Well, for the finance is relatively simple. We know that there was a certain amount of capital invested, which is 235,250. So that's the initial investment, and that's called F. And we decided at the inception that the financial return should be between 5% to 8% for investors. The remaining would go back to environmental projects or to the community. So this was initially decided. It's extremely transparent, so it's very easy to see. And I use the symbol pound because I just want to draw attention to the F and K. The second set of drivers are W and E. So W was the environment, E is the amount, is the percent which we're returning. This is more problematic. How do you measure what the environment has given us? So there are several ways by which we could do this, but I've just proposed a very simple way which has its own flaws and probably shortcomings. And the idea is that if you can measure how much carbon savings have taken place and monetize this, we know we can monetize it because we have a price for carbon. And if you can monetize this over the whole life of the project or the estimated life of the project, we measure the carbon emissions every point in time because they're uh, caught or they're harnessed by a spreadsheet. So we know what we do every day or every minute. And if you can try and monetize it for the entire life of the project, say the project is for 15 years, you get the cumulative monetary returns in the form of carbon emission savings. Now, if you have those returns, we also have a concept in energy, which is the idea of EROI. And the EROI is the ratio of energy delivered to the energy cost. In other words, if you put some amount of energy in making something, how much energy does it actually give back? And there has been a study of various sorts, and it's estimated that this is between 19.8 to 25.2. So if you rely on some of these figures, you can use this 19.8. We've got the figure for how much the savings is over the life. If you use that as a multiplier, we then can get back to what W or the initial environment capital cost is. So this is imputed using those ideas. And if you estimate what the savings are per year and divide it by the capital, you get E%, which is what the value for E is. So slightly flawed, but it's just it's something which we try to do and try to estimate to see whether we could capture the capital of the environment as well as the returns in some particular way. The third leg or the third strand is the community. And without the community, the wind turbine would not have been there. So S is the imputed capital which has been given by the members of the community. Now, how do we capture this? Well, if you think about the number of hours which we spent in terms of meetings, technical expertise, legal expertise, we had volunteers from the village itself doing all this work, appealing the process. At one point, we ran into difficulties, commissioning this whole thing. You have various bits which were involved. And if you use the median wage rate to multiply with the hours, you can get an idea of the monetary value of the capital which is invested by the community. Um, the community also gets the uh, the community also gets sorry, I have just managed to click on something which I didn't intend to, so let me just take you back. The community is also getting back a village allocation per annum. So as I said, the finance people who have invested in the company get between 5 to 8%, but anything above that or some proportion of the profits are then allocated to the village to do various things. And some of them might be people using it for loft insulation, people using light energy bulbs, using blackout curtains to in any form which the enterprise approves to help save further energy usage within the village. So just returning back to more finance, if we have the idea that the return on capital should be equal to the cost. As I pointed out in the start, if a company is paying its investors, it's a cost to the company, but it's a return to the investors. So traditionally, these two should be equal. However, in this kind of situation where there's a win win, where investors themselves live in a nice area and they're benefiting from a good quality environment and they're getting payment in kind for doing things which they want for their loft insulation, etc., they would be in future happy to lend at a lower cost. So where this equation used to be just a sum of all of this, we can actually say that it's not fair to put the cost as a plus sign. We should be subtracting, and the cost would be much smaller than the return. And you can see here that the cost in such a case would be shrinking and it would be less than the return. So they are not symmetrical to each other in cases of a win-win scenario. And if you think that basically everything which uh, the village fund has, if all of it went back to all the investors, just to be simple, we have done some calculations with more complicated scenarios, but then what we find is that if you use this equation, you get a smaller cost than the return. Now, I think it's a bit difficult to show the whole table on screen, but I've tried to illustrate with two particular years at the start in 2010. So to the environment, we were giving back 116%. That means, and that's over 100 because simply because when you put something up like a wind turbine, you're actually rewarding in terms of carbon emission savings because of the nature of EROIA. You're giving back more than it's given you per annum. In terms of the return to the financiers, we are giving back between 5 to 8%. So that particular year, we decided on a figure of 5%. Other years, we have varied. The community that year got very little. It got only 1.09. We had started off and we had not generated much. But in subsequent years, we gave it much more depending on the needs of the community. We also invite people to ask us if they want something in particular for that year. And we've done various things like put an electric meter in the village to try and help in car emissions, electric cars, so charging points. So these are some figures for some 2 years, and overall you'll find the return is somewhere to all the three aspects are 5.06, 5.79. If you take an average from 2008 to 2019, you have somewhere around 7.9% return overall to all the three stakeholders. You have a large portion which has gone back to the community. And because the idea, as I pointed out, is that subsequent um, tranches of capital would be given cheaper because once the community realizes that you're actually helping them in other ways, they prepare to give the capital at a lower cost. So the cost of capital is now around 4.5. On an average, it's around 4.9. This is subject to a lot of volatility because of the nature of environment is volatile. And so there are some estimates of standard deviation, which I will not dwell on too much here. So, why do we get into all this aspect? The idea is that when you teach corporate finance or you talk of corporate finance to bankers, the only thing which is measured is usually what the financiers get back, and that is the driving force for most projects. But if you kind of calculate the return on stakeholders' capital and the cost of stakeholders' capital, if you demonstrate that the returns on stakeholders' capital can be large, first of all, you can do this for any project of any size. Because it's coming out in percentage, it allows comparisons of projects. And bankers may be then prepared to give cheaper access to firms which are offering a larger return to stakeholders' capital. It obviously has links to the climate change policy. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which are in 7 and 13, which I've put on at the bottom, 7 is all about affordable clean energy. 13 is all about climate action. And then there are other social policies which are there about responsible consumption and production in Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable cities and communities. So on a business, from a business school perspective, what we could do is come up with a diagram like this, where if you have a higher return on stakeholders' capital on one axis and the cost of stakeholders' capital on the others. So if you have a higher return on stakeholders' capital but a low cost, you would traditionally find social enterprises and here. And you would find the polluters. If you had high cost, you would find polluters here. So this is a kind of a matrix which helps to capture what companies are doing and where they would fall. And we would hope that in future, such a matrix could be developed and have a wider usage. So thank you for listening. We did publish a paper on this, and this is just a link to the paper. But I will return back to the panel, and I will hopefully invite Jody to talk about his experiences.
Right, thank you, Geeta, and hello, everybody. I'm going to try and share my screen now. You'll be glad to know I only have a couple of slides and only one graph. Select window or screen, it says, so I want to select the entire screen and allow. So, in theory, if I now click on that and then go slideshow, start from first slide, hopefully, and hopefully someone will confirm, you can see a picture of a wind turbine, and above that it says South Brent Community Energy Society. I hope you can see that. I've got no indication whether you can or not. So the South Brent Community Energy Society was set up a couple of years after Sustainable Hockerton's wind turbine project, but it's a very similar project. In fact, to a large extent, we learnt from an awful lot from Simon and Hockerton, and I visited them, and I'm even a member of them. So we basically copied what Hockerton did because it seemed like a good idea. So we bought a second-hand Vestas V27 wind turbine. It cost us a lot more because by the time we installed it, the feed-in tariff had come in, and these machines were very hard to come by. Ours is also financed by a community share offer, slightly different to Hockerton's. Our shares are withdrawable shares, which we pay interest on. So you could argue that our project was financed by debt, whereas Hockerton's shares are transferable shares. And so that project was financed by equity. Anyway, our target rate of interest to our investors is 5%, and all being well, they can also get their initial investment back in the future. As with Hockerton, we intend to, and we do, plough surplus income back into further energy generation and saving projects. So, for example, we have given grants to our local community buildings to install solar PV, LED lighting, insulation, measures like that. I'm only going to dwell on one difficulty with measuring, and that's this question of how much CO2 is saved. So when we started this project back in 2013, the UK's greenhouse gas intensity for electricity, or the carbon intensity for mains electricity, was quite high. It was around 0.5 kilogram per kilowatt hour carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's carbon dioxide and all the other pollutants associated with generating electricity. But as the years have gone by, as you can see on this graph, it is halved, and it's still on a downward trajectory. And indeed, these figures, which come from the Department for Business and Industrial Strategy, or whatever it's called, are when they're published each year, they are based on data from 2 years previously. And of course, when we completely decarbonize the grid, hopefully that will fall to zero. So the challenge for small community energy societies who like to trumpet how many kilograms or tons of CO2 they've saved is that if they use this conversion factor to multiply with their annual generation, they get a declining figure. And at some point, it will be 0. And so that ceases to be arguably a useful measure. So my answer to how much CO2 is saved, and we've got to kind of prepare the argument for this, is none. All generation creates greenhouse gas emissions, some obviously a lot more than others. And I think it's a misuse to use this grid conversion factor, because it's really intended for large companies who are obliged to report their emissions under the Scope 2 protocols. And if you read about that, it's clear that companies, even if they have their own renewable generation on site, their Scope 2 emissions cannot be negative. So in practice, after umming and ahhing about this for quite a while, we just say our wind turbine has generated so many kilowatt hours of low carbon electricity, and kind of leave it at that. It is a really tricky problem, and it's very interesting to hear what Hockington and Geeta have been doing about it, and thinking about it. And I look forward to continuing discussion about it. Right, so if I try and finish my presentation and unscreen share, stop screen. Okay, that's it. That's me done. Thank you.
Geeta, I think you're muted. You need to unmute your mic.
I see. Okay. Well, these are things which we are learning. I said thank you, Jody, for that. And I think it's good to have someone who's playing devil's advocate to our methodology. May I invite Dr. Anjan Ray from India to now contribute to this discussion?
Thank you, Geeta. I hope everybody can see the screen. I am from the other UK, the state of Uttarakhand in India. Our abbreviation is also UK. And what I'd like to talk about is the macroeconomic view rather than the microeconomics and microfinance view that you've heard so far, which forms a complement to the community level thinking by looking at a state level thought around sustainability. So this is, the gentleman in the screen is Dr. Anil Prakash Joshi, the crusader of gross environmental product in Uttarakhand. He runs a sustainable facility about 30 kilometers from where I am. And his argument is that in a primarily agrarian society like India, our measures must be linked to what traditional living was. For example, growth in forest cover or soil quality or ground and surface water metrics or the air that we breathe. In fact, Dehradun, the city that is the capital of Uttarakhand, where I am based, is the 17th most polluted city in India, and that's not a criterion or a number that many of us like over here. So Uttarakhand is the first state in India to announce its intent to measure GEP. This is 10 years after the country recognized the environment as a notional entity, and the National Green Tribunal was formed in India. It is a unique green court. All the environmental laws and any violation of the law can be brought to the attention of this tribunal, and it holds enormous power to enforce environmental regulations. So following the concepts of the NGT, the GEP measurement process in Uttarakhand got kicked off just a couple of months ago. And today, there are experts debating exactly how it should be done, but it primarily uses those parameters around air, water, soil, and also wildlife to form an overall inclusive growth and sustainability model. This brings me back to the key success factors of alternate energy, such as that wind turbine. And I was very pleased to see the EROI, for example, cited in the previous talks, because there are, before we get to sustainability, mostly people ask you about the first four things. You know, does it perform? Does it give you enough? Is it affordable? And does it actually fit existing infrastructure? Luckily, human beings are greedy about energy. We keep consuming more energy, not less. So it's unlikely that you would idle already invested assets. But as your incremental assets become more and more low carbon, you will see the graph that Jody showed of a falling CO2 per unit of energy. We do hope that that happens here too, because that's a desirable state. India has set some very ambitious targets in its nationally determined contribution 2030, in line with the Paris COP21 Accord. So I'm going to give you a chemist's view, because that's what I am, of how we look at this. This is the counting how many fossil fuel carbon atoms we actually import. So India imports some 350 million tons of fossil fuel carbons, and we can either reduce the energy requirement by using more efficient lighting or more efficient machines, or we can reduce the carbon requirement, for example, by a wind turbine. But what I will talk about today is the community supply side response of finding those same 350 million tons of domestic carbon to replace fossil fuel carbon imports. How do we do that? One example, we can repurpose used cooking oil. This is an initiative we have with the Food Safety Standards Organization, which discourages reuse of cooking oil beyond a couple of refrying or rebaking applications. And with our NGO partner, SDC Foundation, we launched this vehicle called the Ruko Express, repurpose used cooking oil, that goes around the city of Dehradun collecting used cooking oil and provides it to us for making biodiesel or biojet fuel. India produces a staggering amount of used cooking oil. We utilize over 20 million tons a year, and close to 1.1 million tons a year is actually achievable in recovery by some recent estimates. Similarly, we can take waste plastics. In fact, the use has gone up during COVID. As many of us will realize, we are receiving more e-commerce materials. There's a lot of PPE in use. And if we could take that waste plastic and turn it back into its constituent carbon atoms as some useful fuel, that would be quite handy. And as a matter of fact, on our campus here, we process 1,000 kilos of waste plastics, and we convert it mostly to diesel in significant yield. So 1 kilo gives 850 milliliters, 1,000 kilos would give us 850 liters of diesel, enough to run quite a few trucks and buses every day. And this represents 5% of the community waste of the city of Dehradun. How do we get that waste? Once again, SDC Foundation comes in as our partner. And by having plastic banks across the city, we are able to collect more than 1,000 kilos daily. And it also spurs community-driven behavior change, because people contribute to these banks, and effectively then they segregate at source, which was not happening at any meaningful level even 3 years ago. So with these very simple examples of community participation on the fuel side, I'm going to wrap up my presentation with some pictures of our campus. How we measure sustainability at the moment is to see what we do in biodiversity. And our bird count has been increasing, so has our butterfly count. And this is the road I walk down every day to office. With that, I thank you.
So thank you very much. I think that has sort of wrapped up our discussion. Now, can we have a look at some of the questions rather briefly? We are just on track on time, so I think I'll take a few questions. Maybe some of you would like to answer that. Considering that environment is a stakeholder, what is the legal position of the environment? Would somebody like to answer this? Anjan, for example?
All right, I did address a bit of that, as for example, in India, though the environment is not a legal entity, it is recognized as being paramount to the extent that there is a separate green court for the purpose, which we call the National Green Tribunal. And beginning to factor the components of the environment into the gross environmental product adds greater credence to the importance of the environment as a balancing factor for pure economy, which can also be linked potentially to human greed or corporate greed. I hope that answers that question briefly.
Yeah. Simon, do you have a view on measurement? Because some of the questions are relating to whether measurement is good or bad.
Well, that's the crux of the problem, really, isn't it? It's I think obviously improved society and more contacts with friends has a value and is important, but measuring it in terms of finance could almost distract us and not encourage us to separate from the finances and actually focus on what's really important, which is sort of friends and family. But on the other hand, I think having converting or translating social impacts and environmental impacts into money, and then allowing the financiers or people who deal in money only to suddenly realize that these other things have a fantastic value in terms of money, if that translation is correct, is really important, because I feel you need to talk to people in their language and to communicate well. Now, there's obviously pitfalls in doing that, but I think by translating some of the environmental impacts and social impacts and into finances, we can actually move the finance system towards being more sustainable. So yeah, it's a tricky balance, and there are certainly big issues in doing that process, but I think it is vital, really.
So Jody, you've already highlighted the problems in measurement. What do you feel? Do you think we should just throw measurement out, or
No, I think it's important, but as Simon has alluded, it's a really tricky one, and the business of it's almost a sort of moral question: is it right to assign a financial value to the natural environment and ecosystem services and so on? I think that's a way, and in the UK, the Natural Capital Committee figured out or suggest methods for doing something like this. I would need to clear up in my own mind the difference between valuation and monetization. And I think it would be too easy to go down a sort of slippery slope where you can exchange the monetized value of an ecosystem to a sort of standard bricks and concrete financial proposition. I don't think, it's really tricky, and certainly some people in the UK, George Monbiot, for example, is quite critical of the work of the Natural Capital Committee. And so, and I'm in no way an expert. I can't really, I just feel slightly uneasy about it. I need persuading, but clearly we need to do something. I like the idea of the gross environmental product. But even there, I'm not quite sure, Anjan, whether you're actually monetizing ecosystem services or whether you, as you suggested in your last slide, you effectively count the butterflies, the area of woodland, or what have you. But anyway, that's my thinking at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are running short of time, but I'll just take one more question. And so there's a question which is very, very, that do you have any practical experience or examples of COSC and ROSC in your case study? So Simon, I think I'll let you answer that, because you had some practical experience with PV systems, and if I remember, you had to go back for a loan, and the loan then was at a lower cost. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So as we've gone along and the turbine was successful, we decided to kind of expand into photovoltaic panels, PV panels, and a local farmer had a roof that he was happy for us to use, and we set up an agreement with him. And to fund those panels, we asked investors for loans, so we didn't have another share issue. We just asked for loans, and the cost of those, basically the interest rates we were proposing for those loans was lower, indicating that people were then able to feel like they could invest at a lower return on those. And I suppose that shows the progression, if you like, that the value's been it's sort of sunk into people, and they've understood that actually it is a good thing to do, and we can loan the money without having such a high interest rate.
Yeah. So I think we are running out of time now, but I'd like to thank everybody for joining in our panel. Dr. Ray from India, who's taken out his time, Jody from South Brent, sitting in a beautiful part of the world, and of course Simon, who is sitting in his kitchen but enjoying the wind turbine as well. And all our viewers who have come in today and who have been expressing their delight in participating. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm wrapping this up. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.